Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 37B, Nixon's Campaigns and the Southern Strategy, an interview with John Farrell. I'm excited to welcome John Farrell to the show today. John is a longtime journalist who has covered the White House and Washington for the Boston Globe and the Denver Post. He has written biographies on folks such as House Speaker Tip O'Neill and President Richard Nixon. And today, we're going to talk about Nixon's quest to reach Washington, the campaigns he ran, and the Southern strategy he developed that had a dramatic impact on the nation's political alignment. Thanks for joining me, John.
My pleasure.
So let's start with what inspired your interest in Richard Nixon?
I have to confess, an editor came to me with my previous book and said, would you be interested in doing a book on Nixon? And I said, yes, for many reasons. You never say no when somebody asks you to do a presidential biography.
Good advice.
But also, I was of his time. When you get to the chapter on his presidency, I talk about the crowd that greeted him in 1969 on Election Day. Mm-hmm. I mean, on Inauguration Day.
Yeah.
And I was in that crowd. So
Wow.
I was, in college during Watergate, and Watergate was a great influence on me deciding to go into journalism. So lots of, and of course, Vietnam hung over everything, all of us in those days. So there were many, many reasons. But basically, he's such a fascinating, complex character that I fell in love with the job. Greatest 6 years of my life.
How did it feel to be diving on research on someone who, as you say, was president over such a big part of your life, such momentous years?
It was very interesting because I knew him and I didn't know him. I knew the caricature, right?
Yeah.
We all knew the caricature, Tricky Dick, but it wasn't until I began to investigate his early life that I realized much more about his strengths and weaknesses. And in the course of conducting research on his presidency, I found an awful lot of things that he had supervised as president in those 7 years that are highly significant. I mean, he created the Environmental Protection Agency with a stroke of the pen. So for pragmatic political reasons, but he is the one who did it. Not Lyndon Johnson and not Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter. So those were the sort of surprises that I came to along the way and made me feel that I wasn't just doing a black and white character. I was getting into the gray, which is what good biography is supposed to be about.
Absolutely. And I've read your biography. It is a fascinating dive into Nixon and all the color to his character. Today, we're going to focus on the Tricky Dick part of his personality. When did he get that nickname, Tricky Dick?
That came from the California Senate race when he was running against Helen Gahagan Douglas, who was a Democratic. She was obviously a woman candidate, a liberal. And Nixon had pioneered in his first race for the House of Representatives in 1946, the anti-communist Red Scare type campaign. And he exaggerated it and carried it to probably its fullest extent in his career when he ran against Douglas and tried to paint her as the Pink Lady. And in response, his critics started calling him Tricky Dick.
Do you think that it was a well-earned nickname? What was he, just like any other politician of his day, or is he especially tricky?
No, I think part of it was that he was a complex character. On one shoulder, he had the better angel of his mother telling him that he should make great progress for the people, make great progress for peace. She was a observant and religious Quaker, and that side of the family was very progressive. On the other side, he had his dad, who was an uneducated man, a very rough character, who was always telling him he had to be tougher, he had to be rougher. And when Nixon got into politics, he immediately saw that there was a benefit in these days after World War II for embracing what the Republican Party, to a certain extent, was doing across the country, which was using tension about the beginning of the Cold War and the atomic era to raise this Red Scare to a fever pitch. Nixon came first. I mean, they call it the McCarthy era, but Richard Nixon in many ways pioneered it. And in one of Joe McCarthy's opening salvos, he actually quoted from Richard Nixon's speech that Nixon had made in Congress. So yeah, he deserved it. He played very rough in those first few campaigns and was treated very rough by the press, and that of course got into this sort of cycle that went on for the rest of his career.
Do we have any sense of what he thought of this reputation that he had gained? You know, was he like, "Oh, that's the media," or was he kind of proud of it? Like, "Yeah, I'm Tricky Dick."
Both. Again, I mean, he was probably happy that he won because his father's and the little devil on the father's side of the shoulder kept saying, you got to win, got to be tough, and so he was no doubt proud of that and somewhat contemptuous of those in the press or in his party, and definitely the other party, who said that he lacked class, and that was a wounding thing for somebody to say about him because he did come from a rough background. He came from the California backwater, the farther reaches of Los Angeles County at a time when it was very not much there other than sagebrush and the first few orange trees.
How did Nixon devise his campaign strategies, from these early ones with the red baiting to, later we'll get into the Southern strategy? Are these all his creations, or did he just have some devious campaign advisors?
He had one particularly devious campaign advisor named Murray Chotiner, but for the most part, this was Nixon. Nixon had a very good innate feel for what his people were thinking, especially what their resentment and their grievances were. And he knew from being of his people, the silent majority, as he would later call it, the great silent majority, what made them tick and what made them afraid, and what he could use, what he could say to exploit that politically. And he was very deft at that all through his career. The flip side of that, the good side of that sort of very receptive political antenna, was that he could read Congress pretty well. He could see trends that were coming that he needed and that he felt that he needed to get on board or even ahead of, such as environmentalism, such as healthcare, and he could see where being too blatantly reactionary would cost him votes. And so he did things like when the Supreme Court ordered him to desegregate the Southern schools with great efficiency and intent. He put together a team and they desegregated the Southern schools. So he was not a dumb man. He was very, very sensitive, but he had this sort of quirky personality, and he would sit by himself on an easy chair with his legs up and a yellow legal pad, and in private, seeking solitude, and just think and think and think these things through and come up with some very sharp political responses. And it was the same with foreign policy, which was his greatest achievement.
And what do you think the goal of it all was? Was the domestic achievements, the foreign policy achievements, was all of it in furtherance of I just want to win? Or were there big, larger goals that he was adhering to?
Yeah, I guess I keep coming back to the sort of the same analogy, which is, in Watergate it was follow the money, and in Biography it's follow the mother.
Yeah.
But I think very much that he had this compelling need to meet his mother's high Quaker standards, and at the same time not fail in front of his father and look weak and like a loser in front of his father. And those things together was put together an immense drive.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating dichotomy of drives there.
Yeah.
Okay, so in his early campaigns, you mentioned.
We're going to stop talking about his mother now. Use that analogy 3 times. Go ahead.
She's there. She's there. Yeah. All right. So in his earliest campaigns, you mentioned he really indulged in the Red Scare to paint congressional or senatorial opponents as communists or pink lady, sympathetic fellow travelers, you might say. Can you give me some solid examples of how he would do this? What are the ways that he would insinuate, or was he just coming out and saying it and planting it in people's minds?
He would take um, measures that the opposing candidate had embraced or endorsed, like free speech for unions or
Hmm. Mhm.
union rights. And because at that time there was a penetration of some noteworthy unions in the United States of America, there was a little bit of grounds for worry that the union movement was being contaminated. And the average person reading the headlines would not draw the distinction between the overall union movement and this particular
Mm.
longshoremen's union or whatever that had been penetrated by communist organizers. And so he would suggest that if one of his opponents was at all supportive or had spoken to a rally or had uh,
Mm.
at any one time befriended or allied themselves with someone with the union movement as a whole, or perhaps even that particular union without any evidence that they had formed some sort of political union with, I'm sorry, political alliance with a communist, that they should therefore be sort of tainted by guilt with association. And
Mhm.
he was very good at insinuating and implying
Mm.
and inferring and not actually coming right out and saying, Helen Hagen Douglas is a card carrying communist. What instead he would just say over and over and over again is that she runs with the wrong crowd. She's too
Mm.
friendly to the communists, and we can't afford to have the pink lady as our senator at a time when Joe Stalin is just
Yeah.
set off an atomic bomb.
And how effective was this for Nixon? And kind of how core was it to his success? Like, would Nixon have won without this line of attack? Or was this how he had his early victories?
No, I think he was probably smart enough and noble enough and idealistic enough in those early campaigns that if this temptation had not come, if the Republican Party had not been using it as a strategy across the country, if Joe McCarthy had not shown how terribly potent it was
Yeah.
a few years later,
Yeah.
that he could have stepped away from it and run and won on other platforms. He was a very, very good politician. He would, I think, have always run some sort of a campaign based on the politics of grievance, because that
Hmm.
seemed to be what he was best at. And when grievance in the late '60s turned into our existing racial
Mm.
divide,
Hmm.
he had no qualms at all about exploiting that, although he would do it with code words. He would
Right.
talk about forced busing rather than integration. And he voted for and supported all the great civil rights bills, but
Right.
he had a way of sort of winking and saying, I understand, I'm on your side. They don't get us, and they never will. But if you go back to his 1968 acceptance speech at the Republican convention,
Yeah.
where he talks about an America that has sirens in the night, and then talks about a young boy coming from the backwoods, the backcountry areas of California, and rising to become vice president and now a presidential nominee. It's a very poetic statement of sort of the American story, the American myth. Just a very complex characters. To be wary of writing him off as um, just an evil
Yeah.
manipulator. He had, he fell victim to his own weaknesses in the end, but
Yeah. Yeah, for
there's
sure.
something Shakespearean about him.
He's one of the most entertaining presidents to learn about because there's just so much there that you don't see coming. In your biography, you write about how outside the box some of Nixon's tricks were, like ordering dozens of pizzas to his opponent's headquarters, or arranging to have African American diplomats dropped off at an opponent's rally and no idea why they're there. What was the purpose of stunts like that? And do you have any favorite, just ridiculous Nixon tricks?
Well, you have to realize that, I mean, he did not
Mm.
sit down and come up with each one of those stunts. But what
Yeah,
happened
I
is
hope
that
that.
no, he encouraged um, an attitude
Yeah,
within his campaign, and in some ways, it was a paranoid attitude. That's us against them. The press
yeah,
is out against us. The liberal establishment is contemptuous of us, and so he would get people like Bob Haldeman, who was his chief of staff, or Pat Buchanan, who was a speechwriter and sort of a go-between with the media, and others. And one of the things about Watergate is that it got away from him.
mm,
He set the tone.
yeah,
Haldeman hired tough guys that would meet the president's tone. The president was always saying, "I want us to be tough. We can't be little girls about this." Um, and you can hear this on the famous White House tapes.
right.
And then his guys would go out and do silly stuff like that. There's a great scene in the movie All the President's Men, where one of them, a guy named Donald Segretti, is being interviewed by Woodward and Bernstein, and he says, it was stuffed with panache, it was stuffed with wit, um, and uh, and Woodward and Bernstein, say, well, then why'd you call it, rat fucking? Yeah. So that was the term
Yes,
within the
yes.
Nixon campaign. Again, there are certainly times on the tapes where he says to Bob Haldeman, "We need more surveillance, bugging, following the Democratic candidates."
Yeah,
But um, the greater sin of Watergate was that he created this atmosphere where these jokers would go out and try to do that sort of thing. He had campaign aides impersonating reporters, and he had private detectives going up to Chappaquiddick when Ted Kennedy's car went off the bridge, and pretending they were reporters so that they could go around Chappaquiddick interviewing people and trying to solve the great cover up of Chappaquiddick. So
mm.
it's sort of an endless list, and the pizza and the diplomats are probably some of the, the funnier ones. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's an element of it, kind of as you're alluding to, like he isn't necessarily ordering it all, but he creates the atmosphere of it. Kind of reminds me to go further back in history, like Henry II. Won't someone rid me of this meddlesome priest?
Exactly.
It's very much that vibe.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So when Nixon ran for president in '68, you alluded to this earlier, he avoided discussing race in that presidential race. There was a third party candidate at that time, Wallace, who was clearly going to win all the racist votes. But in '72, Nixon does start to pursue the Southern strategy. What was the Southern strategy and how did it originate?
Well, Southern strategy goes back to President Eisenhower. And one of the things about Richard Nixon that you can't forget is that he spent 8 years as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And in many, many ways, the lessons that he learned as vice president, watching Eisenhower, this master of government and military bureaucracy and planning, operate, were things that Nixon came away with. Now, Eisenhower, because he was the great war hero, succeeded very well in the 1950s running against Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic governor of Illinois, and picking up states. Never won the solid South, which was the inner South,
Yeah.
but picking up Florida, Tennessee, Virginia, the Carolinas, So the outer South was there, and for the taking was the lesson that Nixon came away with. He got very, very tempted in the 1960 campaign when he ran against John F. Kennedy, the Democrat, and he was sort of torn between, do I campaign as a moderate for and try to build my inner city African American vote, or do I not and go after that border South vote? And he took a campaign swing down through the border states of the South and was thrilled at the huge, enthusiastic crowds. And then a few weeks before the election, Martin Luther King is arrested in Georgia at a protest and taken in the middle of the night to a rural Georgia prison. And his friends and supporters and family is terrified that they're never going to see him alive again. And they reach out to both campaigns through intermediaries, and the Kennedy campaign decides to do something. And they call a Georgia judge and they express national interest in what's going on. And Martin Luther King is released. And the Nixon campaign, Nixon himself, despite a personal plea from one of his close friends, the first black professional baseball player, Major League player, Jackie Robinson, decides he's not going to do anything because he doesn't want to run the risk of alienating the South. And in the end, you can make an argument. If the election was so close, it's hard to put your finger on one thing that tipped that election. But you can make the argument that there were enough electoral votes at stake that could have been influenced if Nixon had won more of the black wards in the northern cities. And so that this is one of the things that carried John Kennedy to victory. And so now he's lost. He sees in 1964 that Barry Goldwater is running as a very conservative Republican candidate and picks up the inner South. And then there's the complication that you spoke of, which is that George Wallace emerges as a racist Democrat or a third party candidate. And so that complicates things. And in 68, Nixon devises what is referred to as Nixon's Southern strategy, which is to try to win moderate to conservative Southern voters, but not with the kind of blatant, gross racism that was practiced by Wallace and his supporters. So he writes off Mississippi, writes off Alabama and Louisiana, but goes very tough at South Carolina and North Carolina. He makes a deal with Strom Thurmond, who was the governor and then senator from South Carolina, that helps him fight off Ronald Reagan's campaign in 1968.
Right, yeah.
In 72, he really doesn't need it because he's running against such a weak Democratic candidate. But you see throughout that election, he's doing the same thing. Again, not by being a blatant racist, but by using code words and winks. And mainly the issue that emerged was compulsory busing, especially cross-jurisdictional busing from suburbs into the cities to integrate schools. And by coming out and proclaiming for local control of schools and against this kind of forced busing by the courts, he sent a signal to his Southern supporters that he was not going to be a pushover for the civil rights movement and black voters and liberals when it came to govern.
And so what he's saying is, I'm for local control, no forced busing. And what they're hearing in the South is, my white child won't have to go to school with a black kid. Is
right, and in again some of the notes well, in this case it's just the notes, not the presidential tapes, but in some of the notes you actually see Haldeman talking to him and writing down, lay off the Negro stuff. So it's more of a step away. In 68, because Wallace was such a virulent candidate,
Yeah.
and because a lot of the liberal intelligentsia had written off the Democrats of Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey, Nixon actually got a lot of good press as the kind of soft, strong man who might be ideal for the rough times. If you remember 1968, we had two
Yeah.
major assassinations. We had riots in the cities, had huge riots and brutality on both sides and violence at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. So, violence and law and order was a major campaign issue for Nixon, and he capitalized on it throughout that fall.
So jumping back to the 72 election, that Southern strategy, you talk about how in 68, Wallace was a big factor, being a candidate. As I recall, one of the pillars of the strategy was make sure Wallace is not an independent candidate in 72. And Nixon applied some government pressure to kind of help bring that about. What happened there? What did Nixon do to keep
Well,
Wallace?
I'm not sure that it's alleged by Wallace's biographer that
Okay.
that or reported by Wallace's biographer. I shouldn't say alleged because that sort of casts doubt upon it. But that Nixon used the IRS and the threat of prosecuting members of Wallace's family for tax issues, and that was the deal. The deal or the understanding that was cut.
Got it. So that's the reporting from Wallace. Pressure was put on us to stay out of the race and ran as a Democrat instead. And then I also want to talk on the Martin Luther King thing in 68 and just Nixon's relationship with that community, which, as I understand it, was he an ally of that community in earlier years or at least friendly to them?
Yeah, I think that nobody was a complete ally to the civil rights movement, except I think some very pious religious folks.
And maybe Hubert Humphrey.
The civil rights movement was self-generated,
Yeah.
and it changed America, transformed America. So the question was, if you're a white politician, where do you stand in relation to this peaceful movement for American rights that's coming mostly out of the South, eventually will move to the North as well. And in the beginning, Nixon was, I'm talking about the 1940s and the 1950s, Nixon and Eisenhower were both, I want to say, allies, or that might be too strong, but sympathizers.
Sure.
Both of them thought this is political and social wildfire, and we have to be very delicate about it. But there's one story that I love, and I come back to all the time about Nixon, and that's when he's in the Senate.
Yeah.
He has come from little Whittier, California, and in Whittier, California, total white bread town. There's like two black people in all of Whittier, and one of them is the shoeshine man at the local barber shop.
Okay.
And the shoeshine man's daughter goes on and becomes an Ivy League graduate, and I believe a successful lawyer, or maybe it was a scientist, but clearly an exceptional human being. And Richard Nixon invites her to the Capitol for lunch. And in segregated Washington, D.C., to the senator's dining room, where the white Southern senators must have dropped their dentures into their soup at seeing this young black woman who wasn't serving, sitting at a table with a U.S. senator. And then afterwards, in a private note to a friend and former law partner, Nixon writes, "It just makes my heart sore to see that in America, the daughter of our Whittier shoeshine man can prosper and go so far in our society." So nobody's ever going to see that letter. It'll be quoted in the press. That's Richard Nixon talking to a friend in confidence. So that he did have that side to him, but he also had this pragmatic, gotta win side.
Right.
And as time went on, he saw that, especially in 1960, he saw that there, or began to believe that the Southern strategy would yield him more votes than a pro-civil rights strategy. That said, unlike Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater, he did not oppose and George Bush, he did not oppose the Civil Rights Act, did not oppose the Voting Rights Act, he did not oppose the Fair Housing Act. And again, when ordered by the courts, Richard Nixon has an exemplary record on integration of schools. And also, it was in his administration that George Shultz and the Labor Department began to pioneer affirmative action. So, as always with Nixon, you have to watch where you're putting your feet, because he's very slippery, and there can be conflicting attitudes at any one time. He
Right.
was he was a supreme pragmatist when it came to politics. And so it's not easy to put your finger on him and say, this man was a racist or this man was a good-hearted liberal. He, at any one time, was very shrewdly charting a course through the political waters that he saw ahead of him.
So when Nixon is presented with the Southern strategy and he starts looking at it, the dog whistling on race, the fact that we're going to use that issue to our political advantage, was there any compunction that we sense, or was he just like, oh, this is good? Did he just love it?
Well, I don't think, given the tenor of the times and the fact that, George Wallace was out there, I don't think that he sort of felt he had a lot to feel guilty about. Even in the 68 campaign, he would go into white suburbs and he would address white Republican crowds and say, look, wake up. You got this big injustice in America, and we're all going to have to solve it together. And so, again, not a guy who was averse to using those dog whistles when he felt that he had to, but also I don't think a deep, hateful man at heart. I think that there was a certain blindness that he had. But he had gone to Duke Law School in North Carolina. He had seen in the South. He had been vice president to Eisenhower when Eisenhower sent in the military to open the Little Rock, Arkansas schools. So he knew what the hatred of some of those guys down in the South were, and he did not embrace them or embrace violence against the civil rights protesters. As so much with Nixon, a complex story.
How did the strategy go over in the South? Did it have the desired effect?
It needed. There was in the 1968 convention, which was the place where it was most important. It needed to overcome the appeal that Ronald Reagan, who jumped into the presidential race late as governor of California, and was the more conservative candidate, and really could pitch to the Southern conservative hearts more than Nixon could.
And Reagan's doing the same thing himself too right now, isn't he? Is he dog whistling, or is he more blatant about it when he's running in 68?
Well, Reagan had a way of being more genial about it, and he also
he did.
And he, like Nixon, maybe it's because they both were Californians, had a way of talking about other issues like law and order, like welfare, like busing, and not really tapping into that repugnant racism that existed.
Not the segregation today, tomorrow, forever of Wallace.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, in 68, the way that Nixon gets around Reagan is that he makes these deals with Southern Republican leaders like Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond gets some sort of vote in the vice presidential selection. He gets nods and winks about a Supreme Court justice from the South, and he gets veiled promises about not using the Justice Department to enforce busing. And so those are the sort of the concrete things that Nixon promises the South to ward off the Reagan challenge at the convention. And Reagan was good at when Reagan ran in 1980.
Yeah.
The first place that he opened his campaign in Mississippi at the county fair, right where the three civil rights near Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the three civil rights workers had famously been murdered in the middle of the 1960s. So Reagan had his own stylistic way with the dog whistles as well.
Wow. Did folks recognize what Nixon was doing when he would indulge in the Southern strategy? Was anybody calling him out on it the way today people are so quick to?
Yeah, of course. The difference there was that 68 was such an unusual year. There was so much violence. Martin Luther King being assassinated, Robert Kennedy being assassinated, that you even had people like Rolling Stones, Gonzo writer Hunter Thompson, or the flip side of that, the mainstream New York City liberal columnists writing these incredible, nice Norman Mailer, the great liberal novelist, writing these pieces saying, well, maybe Nixon wouldn't be that bad because he's not Johnson and he's not Wallace and he's not these crazy nihilistic kids out in the streets of Chicago. And maybe what we need now is, a moderate.
Right.
And so Nixon wins in 1968 as a moderate solution to the disorder in the country.
Yeah. So he holds off Reagan in 68. He wins in a landslide in 72. Where does the Southern strategy evolve from there? You mentioned Reagan a moment ago. How did later presidential candidates follow Nixon's lead and build on the trail he laid out?
Well, Gerald Ford did not. And then you have the first of two elected Southern Democrats, Jimmy Carter, comes in and is elected. And by the end of the Carter administration, to a great extent, race is, and in part because Nixon has integrated the schools, race has begun to slide. Law and order has begun to slide as issues, and you get what's known as. Well, Reagan was successful running as a foreign policy hawk and an economic conservative, and also appealing to the so-called social issues. And so race had fallen into this package of the social issues, busing, abortion, drugs, permissiveness, pornography, all the things that middle Americans looking at the media's portrayal of their society, what scared them, or even what their kids were bringing home from school, rock music and rock lyrics, Hollywood movies. The whole culture seemed to be running away and escaping from the understanding and the control of middle America. And so first with Nixon and then with Reagan, and by the end of the Reagan years, even that had begun to sort of ebb, and you found that George Herbert Warren Bush, his successor, was not one for the dog whistles the way that his predecessors had been. So the two gigantic things happen. One is the Cold War reaches a peak and ends. Yeah. And the other thing is that the American economy goes through a wrenching post-industrial change in the Ford and Carter, and then the first couple of years of the Reagan administration, all of which sort of overshadow the civil rights movement, which in turn has lost some of its most charismatic leaders. And is now, the media has shown a fascination with promoting black separatists rather than the old civil rights crowd, so that Ralph Abernathy, King's successor, begins to fade, and you get people like Malcolm X and others are become more glorified anyway, even if their following is hardly ever as big as Martin Luther King's was.
What was the lasting impact or stamp that Nixon put on the way presidential elections are run? And also, kind of separate question, on just the dialogue around the legacy of race in this country. What was his stamp and his impact on those two topics?
Well, one thing that is not we don't pay a lot of attention to now is that so there was Nixon, and then there was Watergate, and then there was a whole bunch of post-Watergate reforms.
Yeah.
One thing that Nixon was incredibly successful at, excuse me, was raising secret money from rich people.
Ooh.
And one of the Watergate had many planks, and one of the planks of Watergate was just the outright corruption, the suitcases with $500,000 in $100 bills, being donated from defense contractors. Mm-hmm. All that was supposed to have been put to an end by a series of campaign finance reforms after Watergate, all of which have now been rolled back by either politicians in the Senate or the United States Supreme Court, so that now we are back to where we were in the Nixon era. So Nixon, one of the legacies of Nixon was that Nixon showed how sort of a legal corruption of the system, which we're back to now. In fact, the great thing in common in both cases is that we don't know who the people are that are contributing suitcases of money and buying candidacies. So that, I think, is one thing that one great legacy. The other great legacy, especially in the age of Trump, I think, and the age of Fox News, is that Nixon was a very important early practitioner of this politics of grievance. He was one of, there were others. Certainly, the movement goes back to the 1920s to the fundamentalist movement and the some elements of the prohibitionist movement, to William Jennings Bryan and the Scopes Monkey trial and the fight against teaching evolution in the schools. I mean, this is a strain in American history that's been there. The countryside has always been resentful of the elites. Mm-hmm. In North Carolina, before the American Revolution, the elites and the city folks almost went to war in a series of fights called the Regulator Battles. So, I mean, it's been there for many, many years, as long as we've been around. So you can't point your finger at Nixon and say, okay, so Nixon McCarthy, Wallace, Trump. Yeah. But if you want to look at the highlights of recent modern American political history, it's Nixon, McCarthy, Wallace, and Trump. Those are the four who have shown the best at convincing, and Trump with the that Australian immigrant Rupert Murdoch, who have shown that they were the best at bringing out the worst in us by scaring us, by distorting reality to the point where we begin to hate our fellow Americans. And I just think, as a rule of the thumb, any commentator or politician who tries to teach you to hate your fellow Americans, I think, automatic disqualification in my book. But evidently, it has worked. Has worked very well over many years. The miracle, perhaps, is that it takes a shrewd amount of talent, like Nixon's, or accidents of history, like the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, and they're generating McCarthy and Wallace, and the unique circumstances that we have today with America changing from a lily white country of 180 million to a multicultural country of 360 million, to bring forth a Donald Trump. So it doesn't always happen, but these guys are out there. These guys and gals are always out there. The Marjorie Taylor Greens are always out there, looking for their opportunity, looking for their shot. And Nixon was a adept practitioner of it and a teacher to others
Mm.
how it could be done. And that probably is why um, his reputation um, is as
Mm.
bad as it is among half the American electorate.
If you've enjoyed this interview with John and want to learn more about Nixon, please consider picking up Richard Nixon, The Life from your nearest bookstore or visit jafarrell.com. That's JAFARRELL.com for this and other books from John Farrell. Thank you for your time, John.
Thanks, Kenny. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and paid host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, imagine you've never been elected vice president, and you've never been elected president, but because of the scandalous resignations of both of those positions, you are suddenly thrust into the presidency, and all people want to do is ask you about Watergate. What would you do? Well, we'll find out what Gerald Ford did next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.